The morning sun was barely peeking through the airport windows when Robert checked his watch for the 10th time. Flight 447 to Chicago was already running late, and he could feel his stomach tightening with worry. Next to him, his 12-year-old son Michael sat perfectly still in the waiting area chair. His hands pressed firmly over his ears, eyes fixed on the pattern in the carpet below. Robert had planned this trip down to the smallest detail. He'd booked first-class seats hoping the extra space would help. He'd packed Michael's favorite noise-canceling headphones, the blue ones with the soft padding that his son never traveled without. In his carry-on bag were Michael's preferred snacks, plain crackers, apple slices cut exactly the same size, and a small container of water at room temperature. The tablet was fully charged with Michael's favorite videos downloaded and ready to play. But despite all his careful planning, Robert could see the signs. The slight rocking motion that meant Michael was getting overwhelmed. The way his son's breathing was becoming shorter and faster. The airport was louder than usual today, with construction work echoing through the terminal and extra announcements blaring over the speakers. Flight 447 to Chicago will be delayed another 30 minutes due to air traffic control issues, came the announcement that made Robert's heart sink. Michael's rocking became more noticeable. A woman sitting nearby glanced over with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Robert quickly moved to sit closer to his son, speaking in the calm, steady voice he'd learned to use during difficult moments. "Michael, remember what we talked about? We're going to see Grandpa in Chicago. The plane is just waiting for its turn to fly safely. Everything is okay." Michael didn't respond, but his rocking slowed down just a little. Robert pulled out the tablet and started one of Michael's favorite videos about trains. For a few minutes, it seemed like things might be okay, but then came another announcement, followed by the sound of a cleaning cart rolling by with squeaky wheels, and a baby started crying somewhere across the waiting area. It was too much. Michael's hands flew to his ears, pressing harder than before. His whole body started trembling, and Robert knew they were heading toward a meltdown. He'd seen it countless times before, but it never got easier. In public places like this, it felt 10 times worse. When boarding finally began, Robert hoped that getting onto the plane and into their seats would help. Sometimes the enclosed space was comforting for Michael. They made their way down the jet bridge, Michael walking close behind his father, still covering his ears. The first-class cabin was quieter than the terminal, which gave Robert a moment of relief. Their seats were in the second row, with plenty of space and no one directly behind them. Robert had specifically chosen these seats online, thinking ahead about every possible scenario. "Here we are, buddy," Robert said softly as they settled in. "Remember, window seat for you, just like we planned." Michael climbed into his seat and immediately put on his headphones. He pulled out his favorite fidget toy, a small cube with different textures on each side that helped him stay calm. For a few minutes, everything seemed under control. Other passengers filed past them, and Robert felt hopeful that this might actually go smoothly. But then the real problem started. A flight attendant came over the intercom with pre-flight announcements, her voice echoing through the cabin speakers. Someone a few rows back was talking loudly on their phone, trying to finish a business call before takeoff. The overhead bins were slamming shut as passengers stored their luggage. Each sound seemed to hit Michael like a physical blow. Robert watched his son's face change. The calm expression disappeared, replaced by the tight, stressed look that meant trouble was coming. Michael started pulling at his headphones, adjusting them over and over, but nothing seemed to block out enough of the noise. "It's okay, Michael," Robert whispered, leaning closer. "We'll be in the air soon, and it will be quieter then." But Michael was already past the point where words could help. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His hands started flapping, a movement that usually helped him cope with stress, but today it wasn't working. The fidget toy fell to the floor as Michael's movements became more frantic. Robert quickly picked up the toy and tried to hand it back, but Michael pushed it away. His son's eyes had that glazed, overwhelmed look that meant he was shutting down from too much sensory input. The sounds, the lights, the unfamiliar smells of the airplane, the feeling of being trapped in a small space with strangers. It was all building up inside Michael like pressure in a balloon. "Sir, is everything all right?" A flight attendant appeared beside their row, her voice kind but clearly concerned. "He has autism," Robert explained quietly, hoping other passengers couldn't hear. "Flying is sometimes difficult for him. He'll be okay once we're in the air and things settle down." The flight attendant nodded with understanding, but Robert could see the worry in her eyes. She'd probably dealt with situations like this before, But that didn't make it any easier for anyone involved. As the plane began to push back from the gate, the engine noise grew louder. Michael's distress escalated with it. His hands pressed against his ears so hard that Robert worried he might hurt himself. The rocking motion was back, more intense than before. "No, no, no," Michael started saying, his voice getting louder with each repetition. Robert's heart broke watching his son struggle. He'd tried so hard to make this trip work. They were flying to Chicago for his father's 75th birthday, a celebration that meant everything to the family. Robert's mother had been planning it for months, and Michael loved his grandfather dearly. During calm moments at home, Michael had been excited about the trip, talking about seeing Grandpa and riding in an airplane. But now, trapped in this metal tube surrounded by strangers, all of that excitement had turned into pure fear and overwhelm. The plane started its taxi toward the runway, and the motion seemed to push Michael over the edge completely. What had started as quiet distress exploded into a full meltdown. Michael began screaming, a high-pitched sound of pure anguish that filled the entire first-class cabin. Every head turned toward them. Robert felt dozens of eyes staring, judging, wondering what was wrong and why he couldn't control his child. But his focus stayed on Michael, trying desperately to help his son through the storm of emotions and sensations that was overwhelming his young mind. This was going to be a very long flight. Michael's screaming cut through the airplane cabin like a siren. Every passenger in first class had stopped what they were doing to stare at the commotion in row 2. Robert felt heat rising in his cheeks as he tried everything he could think of to help his son, but nothing was working. "Michael, please, buddy," Robert whispered urgently, trying to keep his voice calm even though his heart was racing. "Look at me. Try to breathe slowly like we practiced." But Michael was too far gone into his meltdown to hear his father's words. His whole body was rigid with stress, his hands covering his ears, eyes squeezed shut as he continued to scream. The sound was raw and desperate, the kind of cry that comes from someone in real pain, even though that pain wasn't physical. A man in the seat across the aisle cleared his throat loudly and shot Robert a look that could have frozen water. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that carried clearly over Michael's screaming. "Some of us are trying to work here. Can't you do something about this?" Robert's jaw tightened. "I'm doing everything I can, sir. My son has autism, and he's having difficulty with the flight environment." The man rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath about proper parenting. And kids these days. He made a big show of putting on expensive noise-canceling headphones and opening his laptop with sharp, angry movements. An elderly woman in the row behind them leaned forward, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes with age. "In my day, children knew how to behave in public. Perhaps you should have considered whether he was ready for air travel before subjecting the rest of us to this." Robert turned around, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ma'am, my son can't help this reaction. We're doing our best." "Well, your best isn't good enough," she snapped back. "This is first class. We paid good money for a peaceful flight." The comment stung worse than Robert had expected. He'd dealt with judgment before, in restaurants, grocery stores, playgrounds, but something about being trapped in an airplane made it feel so much worse. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape the stares and whispered comments. A younger woman near the front turned around in her seat. "Is there a doctor on board?" "Maybe the child needs medical attention." "He doesn't need a doctor," Robert replied, louder than he intended. "He needs understanding." But his words fell on deaf ears. More passengers were getting involved now, some offering unwanted advice, others making it clear they thought Robert should somehow magically fix the situation. The flight attendant who had checked on them earlier returned, this time with a more senior crew member. "Sir," the head flight attendant said quietly, "we need to discuss some options. If this continues much longer, we may need to consider returning to the gate." Robert's heart sank. The thought of turning around, of failing to get Michael to his grandfather's birthday celebration, of dealing with the embarrassment of being removed from a flight, it was almost too much to bear. "Please," Robert said, "just to give us a few more minutes. Once we're in the air and things settle down, he'll be better. I promise." Meanwhile, 3 rows back in economy class, 10-year-old David sat with his grandmother, listening to the distress coming from the front of the plane. Unlike the first-class passengers, David wasn't annoyed by the sounds. He recognized them. "Grandma," David whispered, tugging on his grandmother's sleeve. That boy up there sounds just like Tommy when he gets overwhelmed. David's grandmother, Mrs. Johnson, looked toward the front of the plane with concern rather than irritation. She knew exactly what David was talking about. His little brother Tommy was 8 years old and had autism, and she'd witnessed many situations just like this one. That poor family, she murmured, shaking her head. People just don't understand. David unbuckled his seatbelt and started to stand up, but his grandmother gently pulled him back down. "Where are you going, baby?" "I want to help," David said simply. "I know what to do when Tommy gets like that. Maybe I can help that boy, too." Mrs. Johnson looked at her grandson with a mixture of pride and worry. David had always been mature for his age, partly because of what he'd learned from living with a brother who needed extra support. He'd been to therapy sessions with Tommy, had learned techniques from doctors and specialists, and had a natural way with children who were struggling. But this was an airplane full of strangers, and the boy up front was white and clearly from a wealthy family, while they were black and flying economy because it was all they could afford. Mrs. Johnson had lived long enough to know that good intentions didn't always protect you from misunderstandings. "David, honey, that's very kind of you, but this isn't our place. Those people don't know us, but Grandma, that boy is hurting. I can hear it in his voice. It's just like when Tommy can't make the world feel safe anymore." Back in first class, Michael's screaming had settled into exhausted sobs, but the damage to the cabin's atmosphere was done. Passengers were openly complaining now, some demanding to speak to the captain, others insisting that the family be removed from the flight. "This is ridiculous," the businessman across the aisle announced to anyone who would listen. "I fly first class specifically to avoid situations like this. What are we paying premium prices for if we have to deal with uncontrolled children?" Robert felt anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused on Michael. Getting into an argument with other passengers wouldn't help his son, and it might make things even worse. A flight attendant approached with a clipboard. "Sir, I need to document this incident. Can you tell me your son's condition and whether you have any medical documentation?" "He has autism spectrum disorder," Robert replied, feeling like he was being interrogated. "I have his medical information if you need it, but there's nothing medically wrong with him right now. He's just overwhelmed by the sensory input." The flight attendant nodded and made notes, but Robert could see other crew members talking in hushed tones near the galley. They were clearly discussing what to do about the situation. Michael's sobs were quieter now, but his whole body was still shaking with stress. He wouldn't look at anyone, wouldn't accept comfort, wouldn't take his headphones off even though they didn't seem to be helping. Robert felt completely helpless. In economy class, David watched his grandmother's face as she listened to the continued distress from the front of the plane. He could see her internal struggle, the same one he was feeling. Every instinct told them to help, but social barriers and fear of misunderstanding held them back. "Grandma," David said quietly, "remember what Pastor Williams always says about being the hands and feet of love in the world?" Mrs. Johnson looked at her grandson, seeing wisdom in his young eyes that sometimes surprised her. "David, baby, sometimes doing the right thing isn't simple, but helping people who are hurting is always simple," David replied. "Tommy taught me that." The plane was starting to taxi faster now, preparing for takeoff. Michael's distress seemed to spike with each new sound and movement. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, praying for strength and for some kind of miracle that would help his son get through this flight. He had no idea that Miracle was sitting just a few rows behind them, waiting for the courage to stand up. The airplane engines grew louder as they prepared for takeoff, and Michael's distress reached a breaking point. His exhausted sobs had turned back into screaming, and Robert could see the flight attendants having an urgent discussion near the cockpit. The head flight attendant was holding a phone, probably talking to the captain about whether they needed to abort takeoff. "That's it," the businessman across the aisle announced loudly. "I'm calling my lawyer. This is unacceptable." The elderly woman behind them was shaking her head dramatically. "In all my years of flying, I've never experienced anything like this. Someone needs to take control of this situation." Robert felt the walls closing in around him, the judgment from other passengers, the worried looks from the crew, and most of all, his son's obvious pain. It was becoming too much to handle. He was running out of options and running out of time. That's when something unexpected happened. A small voice came from behind them, calm and gentle despite the chaos. "Excuse me, ma'am." A young boy was standing in the aisle, speaking to the head flight attendant. He was maybe 10 years old, with kind eyes and a serious expression that seemed too mature for his age. His clothes were neat but clearly not expensive, a simple t-shirt and jeans that had probably been carefully selected for travel. "I think I might be able to help," David said quietly to the flight attendant. "My little brother has autism too, and I know some things that might work." The flight attendant looked surprised. She glanced back toward economy class where she could see an older black woman watching with concerned eyes. The contrast was stark. This young boy from economy class wanting to help the wealthy white family in first class when no one else seemed willing to try. "Sweetie, that's very kind of you," the flight attendant said. "But I'm not sure." "Please," David interrupted politely. "I really think I can help. The boy up there sounds just like my brother Tommy when he gets overwhelmed. I know what works for him." Robert heard the conversation and turned around, seeing this young stranger offering help when everyone else had only offered criticism. Something in the boy's confident, caring demeanor gave him hope. "I'll try anything at this point," Robert said to the flight attendant. "If he thinks he can help, please let him try." The businessman across the aisle scoffed. "This is getting ridiculous. Now we're letting random children handle the situation?" But the flight attendant made a decision. "Okay," she said to David. "But you need to be very careful, and if I tell you to step back, you step back immediately." David nodded seriously and walked slowly toward Michael's row. He didn't make any sudden movements or try to get too close right away. Instead, he sat down on the floor in the aisle, just within Michael's sight but not close enough to feel threatening. Robert watched in amazement as David began speaking in a soft, rhythmic voice that somehow cut through Michael's screaming. "Hey there," David said calmly. "I bet this airplane feels really loud and scary right now. I know because my brother Tommy feels the same way sometimes." Michael's screaming didn't stop immediately, but something in David's voice seemed to reach him. His crying became less intense, more like he was listening even through his distress. "You know what's really cool about airplanes?" David continued in that same steady, soothing tone. "They're like giant birds, but they're made of metal. The engines are really loud because they have to be super strong to lift all these people up into the sky." David pulled a small object from his pocket, a stress ball with soft spikes on it, the kind used in occupational therapy. He placed it on the floor where Michael could see it but didn't try to hand it to him directly. "This is Tommy's favorite fidget toy," David explained. "Sometimes when the world feels too loud or too bright or too much, holding something like this helps him remember that he's safe." Michael's screaming had reduced to hiccuping sobs. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut, opened slightly to look at the toy David had placed nearby. Robert was speechless. In all the years of dealing with Michael's meltdowns, he'd never seen a stranger, especially another child, have this kind of calming effect on his son. David continued talking in his gentle, matter-of-fact way. "Tommy taught me that when everything feels like too much, it helps to think about one thing at a time instead of everything all at once. Like right now, we could just think about breathing, in and out, slow and steady," David demonstrated, taking slow, exaggerated breaths. "Tommy and I practice this together. Sometimes I count for him. 1, 2, 3, breathe in. 1, 2, 3, breathe out." Incredibly, Michael started trying to match David's breathing pattern. His sobs were becoming quieter, his body less rigid with panic. The businessman across the aisle had stopped complaining and was watching with obvious surprise. The elderly woman behind them had gone completely quiet. Even the flight attendants were staring in amazement at what was happening. "You're doing great," David encouraged softly. "Tommy would be really proud of how hard you're trying. He always says that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep trying even when things are scary." Michael slowly reached for the stress ball. David smiled but didn't make a big deal about it, just kept talking in that same calm, steady voice. "The airplane is going to start moving faster now to get up in the sky," David explained. "It might feel weird in your tummy like going down a big hill, but once we're up high it gets much quieter and smoother. It's actually pretty cool up there." The plane began its takeoff roll, engines roaring as they built up speed. Robert tensed, expecting Michael to start screaming again, but his son was focused on David's voice and the stress ball in his hands. "Here we go," David said cheerfully. "Tommy always pretends he's a superhero when this happens. He says the airplane is his superhero vehicle taking him on an adventure." Michael's grip on the stress ball tightened, but he wasn't screaming. He was listening, trying to follow David's breathing exercises, and for the first time since they'd boarded the plane, he looked calm. As the airplane lifted off the ground, David started talking about clouds and how they looked like cotton balls from above, about how cities looked like toy models, about how the airplane pilots were like very careful drivers in the sky. Robert felt tears in his eyes as he watched his son respond to this young stranger's kindness. Michael was still overwhelmed, still stressed, but he was no longer in the grip of pure panic. David had somehow created a bridge of understanding that reached across all the differences between them: age, race, economic background, and touched the universal experience of a child helping another child. The cabin had grown quiet except for David's gentle voice and the steady hum of the engines. Other passengers were watching in wonder, some with shame on their faces as they realized how wrong their initial reactions had been. "You're being so brave," David told Michael as the plane climbed steadily into the sky. "Tommy would really like you. You both know how to work hard when things are difficult." For the first time since boarding, Michael made eye contact with someone other than his father. He looked at David with curiosity, and something that might have been gratitude. The miracle wasn't just that Michael was calm. It was that in a world that often seemed divided by differences, two children had found their way to each other through simple human compassion. As the airplane leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin grew quieter and more peaceful. Michael was still holding David's stress ball, rolling it between his hands in a way that seemed to calm him. For the first time since they'd boarded, his breathing was normal, and his body had relaxed. David remained sitting on the floor in the aisle, continuing to speak in that gentle, steady voice that had worked such magic. "See, I told you it would get quieter up here. Now we're flying through the clouds like a bird." Michael looked toward the window for the first time during the flight. "Clouds," he said softly, the first word he'd spoken since his meltdown began. "That's right," David smiled. "Tommy loves looking at clouds. He says they look like different animals sometimes." "Do you see any animals in those clouds?" Robert watched in amazement as his son actually leaned toward the window, studying the fluffy white formations outside. "Dog," Michael said, pointing at a particularly large cloud. "I see it too," David said with genuine excitement. "That's a really good one. You have great eyes for finding shapes." The flight attendant who had been monitoring the situation came over quietly. "Is everyone okay here?" she asked, but her tone was warm now, not worried. "We're doing great," David replied confidently. "Michael is really good at spotting cloud animals." Robert finally found his voice. "I don't know how to thank you," he said to David. "What you just did, I've never seen anything like it." David looked up at Robert with a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "My brother Tommy taught me a lot about helping people when they're overwhelmed. He's really smart even when the world feels too big for him." "How old is Tommy?" Robert asked. "He's 8. He was diagnosed with autism when he was 4, so our whole family learned about it together. I go to his therapy sessions sometimes, and the doctors taught me ways to help when he gets upset." Robert shook his head in wonder. "You're just a kid yourself, but you knew exactly what to do when I felt completely helpless." "Kids helping kids just makes sense sometimes," David said simply. "We understand each other differently than grown-ups understand us." The businessman across the aisle, who had been so critical earlier, cleared his throat. When Robert looked over, the man's expression had completely changed. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I didn't understand the situation, and I was out of line with my comments." Robert nodded, appreciating the apology but more focused on his son, who was now quietly talking with David about the different shapes they could see in the clouds. "My name is Michael," his son said to David, offering this information voluntarily for the first time with a stranger in months. "That's a great name," David replied. "I'm David. It's really nice to meet you, Michael." The elderly woman behind them leaned forward again, but this time her voice was soft and apologetic. "Young man," she said to David, "what you did here was extraordinary. I'm ashamed of how I reacted earlier." David turned to her with the same kindness he'd shown Michael. "That's okay, ma'am. People don't always know about autism, so they don't understand what's happening. Tommy taught me that educating people is part of helping." Robert was struck by the wisdom in this child's words. "David, can I ask where you learned to be so good at this?" "From Tommy, mostly, but also from watching my grandma. She always says that when someone is hurting, you don't ask questions first, you help first and understand later." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Johnson appeared at the edge of the first-class section. She'd been worried about David and had come to check on him. "David, baby, are you bothering these folks?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was proud rather than concerned. "Grandma, this is Michael and his dad Robert," David said. "Michael has autism like Tommy, and we've been talking about clouds." Mrs. Johnson looked at Robert with understanding eyes. "I hope David wasn't overstepping. He has a big heart when it comes to helping other children." "Overstepping?" Robert stood up, extending his hand to Mrs. Johnson. "Ma'am, your grandson just saved our flight. He did something I couldn't do, something the flight attendants couldn't do. He reached my son when no one else could." Mrs. Johnson shook Robert's hand, noting the genuine gratitude in his voice. "David's always been special that way. Living with Tommy has taught him things most adults never learn." The head flight attendant appeared, having heard parts of the conversation. "I have to say, in 15 years of flying, I've never seen anything quite like what happened here today. David, you have a real gift." David blushed slightly. "I just did what works for Tommy." Michael, who had been listening to the conversation while continuing to play with the stress ball, suddenly spoke up. "Can David sit with us?" Robert looked at the flight attendant questioningly. She nodded. "I think we can arrange that. Would that be okay with you, Mrs. Johnson?" "If it's not too much trouble," Mrs. Johnson replied. "David would love that." The flight attendant quickly rearranged seating so that David could sit next to Michael, while Mrs. Johnson was moved to a nearby seat. As David settled in next to Michael, Robert noticed how naturally the two boys interacted. "Tommy has one of these tablets too," David said as Michael showed him his device. "He likes watching videos about trains." "I like trains," Michael said, his voice growing more confident. "And airplanes and buses. Transportation is cool," David agreed. "Tommy knows everything about subway systems. He can tell you how to get anywhere in our city using trains and buses." Robert listened as the two boys found common ground, talking about their interests and their experiences. David had a natural way of relating to Michael that made conversation easy and comfortable. The businessman across the aisle was working on his laptop, but Robert noticed him glancing over occasionally with a thoughtful expression. The elderly woman had taken out a book but seemed more interested in watching the interaction between the two boys. "David," Robert said after a while, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How did you know that approaching Michael slowly and sitting on the floor would help?" David considered the question seriously. "When Tommy gets overwhelmed, direct eye contact and sudden movements make it worse. Sitting lower down makes me seem less threatening, and talking about facts instead of feelings usually works better because facts are predictable and feelings can be scary when you're already upset." Robert was amazed. "That's incredibly insightful. Some adults never figure that out." "Tommy's a good teacher," David said simply. "He's taught me that being different isn't bad, it's just different. And different people need different kinds of help." Mrs. Johnson smiled at her grandson. "David's always been wise beyond his years. His mama used to say he was born with an old soul." As the flight continued, Robert found himself thinking about how wrong his assumptions had been. He'd expected judgment and criticism from other passengers, and he'd gotten that from the people who looked most like him. But help and understanding had come from a place he never would have expected. A young boy from a different background who understood more about autism than most adults ever would. Michael was now showing David his favorite videos, and the two boys were discussing the technical specifications of different types of a tiercraft. For the first time in hours, Robert could relax and simply enjoy watching his son be happy. The flight that had started as a nightmare was turning into something beautiful. A reminder that compassion and understanding could come from the most unexpected places. The rest of the flight passed peacefully, with Michael and David talking quietly about everything from airplane engines to their favorite foods. Robert found himself learning things about his own son that he'd never known before. In David's presence, Michael seemed more comfortable expressing himself and sharing his thoughts. As they began their descent into Chicago, Robert noticed Michael wasn't showing any signs of the anxiety that usually came with landing. David was explaining what was happening, how the pilot was slowly bringing the plane down, why their ears might feel funny and how the ground would look bigger and bigger as they got closer. "Tommy always counts during landing," David told Michael. "He counts to 100, and by the time he's done, we're usually on the ground." Michael nodded and started counting softly. Robert watched in amazement as his son handled the landing, better than he ever had before, all because a 10-year-old boy had given him a strategy that worked. When the plane touched down and began taxiing to the gate, Michael actually smiled. "We made it," he said to David. "We sure did," David replied. "You did a really great job on your first flight with me." "It wasn't my first flight," Michael corrected seriously, "but it was my first good flight." Those words hit Robert right in the heart. How many experiences had Michael endured rather than enjoyed simply because no one understood how to help him feel safe and comfortable? As passengers began gathering their belongings, Robert realized he didn't want this connection to end. David had given his family something precious, not just help during a crisis, but a new understanding of what was possible for Michael. "David," Robert said, "could I get your grandmother's contact information? I'd love to stay in touch." Mrs. Johnson looked surprised. "Oh, you don't need to feel obligated." "It's not obligation," Robert interrupted gently. "What happened today changed everything for us. David showed me things about helping Michael that I never knew, and I'd love for the boys to stay friends if they'd like that." "I'd like that," Michael said immediately, which surprised everyone since he rarely expressed preferences about social situations. "Me too," David agreed with a big smile. As they waited to deplane, Robert learned more about David's family. Mrs. Johnson worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and helping at a daycare during the day. David's mother worked as a nurse's aide while going to school to become a registered nurse. They were traveling to Chicago for a family reunion, using money they'd been saving for over a year. The more Robert learned, the more impressed he became with this family who had raised such an extraordinary young man, despite facing challenges he could barely imagine. When they finally left the plane, Robert made a decision that would change all their lives. "Mrs. Johnson," he said as they walked through the airport together, "I'd like to ask you something, and please don't feel pressured to answer right away. I run a technology company, and I'm always looking for people with strong character and work ethic. Would you be interested in learning about some opportunities?" Mrs. Johnson stopped walking and stared at him. "Sir, I appreciate the thought, but I don't have any technology experience." "Experience can be taught," Robert replied. "Character can't. What David did today showed me the kind of values your family has, and those are the values I want in my company." Over the next few weeks, Robert followed through on his promise. He learned that Mrs. Johnson had been trying to save money to help pay for David's education. The boy was gifted academically and dreamed of becoming a doctor someday. Robert offered Mrs. Johnson a position in his company's human resources department, with training provided, and a salary that would allow her to work just 1 job instead of 2. But more importantly, he arranged for Michael and David to meet regularly. David became not just Michael's friend, but also an unofficial consultant to Robert about understanding autism. With David's help, Robert learned new ways to communicate with his son, new strategies for dealing with overwhelming situations, and new appreciation for Michael's unique way of seeing the world. The boys video chatted several times a week, sharing their interests and supporting each other through challenges. David would tell Michael about his school day and his brother Tommy's latest achievements. Michael would share his excitement about new trains he'd seen or books he'd read. Robert also began supporting David's education directly, setting up a scholarship fund that would ensure the boy could pursue his dream of becoming a doctor. But perhaps more valuable than the financial support was the mentorship Robert provided, helping David understand that his natural gifts for helping others could take him anywhere he wanted to go. 6 months after the flight, Robert invited David and his family to visit them for a weekend. Watching Michael interact with David and Tommy in person was a revelation. Michael, who usually struggled in social situations, was patient and gentle with Tommy, showing him his toy trains and explaining how they worked. David's family dynamics had taught Michael new ways of being kind and inclusive. The businessman from the flight, whose name turned out to be Paul, had tracked down Robert through LinkedIn after thinking about what he'd witnessed. He reached out to apologize again and to ask if he could make a donation to autism research in Michael's name. That led to a conversation about autism awareness in the workplace, and Paul ended up implementing autism-friendly policies at his own company. Even the elderly woman from the flight, Mrs. Chen had been moved to action. She began volunteering with an autism support group in her city, saying that watching David's compassion had inspired her to want to help other families. But the most significant change was in Robert himself. The experience had opened his eyes to the assumptions he'd made about where wisdom and help would come from. He'd expected other wealthy, educated people to understand and support his family, when in reality it was a young boy from a different background who had the knowledge and heart to help. Robert began speaking at autism awareness events, always telling the story of David's intervention on the flight. He talked about how his son had been helped not by medical professionals or autism experts, but by a 10-year-old boy who understood autism through love rather than textbooks. David continued to excel in school, but he also began volunteering with younger children who had autism, using the same gentle techniques that had worked with Michael. His dream of becoming a doctor grew stronger, but now it was focused specifically on helping children with developmental differences. The flight that had started as Robert's worst nightmare had become the catalyst for connections and changes that enriched all their lives. It proved that sometimes the most profound help comes from the most unexpected places, and that a child's pure intention to help another child can create ripples of positive change that extend far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Michael still had difficult days and challenging moments, as all children with autism do. But now he had strategies that worked, a friend who understood him, and a father who had learned to see his differences as strengths rather than obstacles to overcome. And somewhere in Chicago, a young boy named David continued to change lives simply by doing what came naturally to him, seeing someone who needed help, and reaching out with kindness, courage, and an understanding that came straight from the heart.